Recently, I talked about how if you're conflicted on buying a new GPU or waiting for next generation GPUs, one of the suggestions I had was that for the time being, you could buy something on the lower end side to help you bide your time, and the RTX 3050 may just be the perfect candidate to fulfill that role. Let's take a look at that in this video. Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video. Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. For this video, we'll be checking out the MSI RTX 3050 Gaming X graphics card. I'm actually quite excited and very interested in checking out this GPU because over the past few years, a lot of my focus on the channel and most of the GPU reviews I've done have been for mid-range, high-end, and enthusiast level graphics cards. While those kinds of GPUs showcase impressive performance, high FPS figures, and allow the user to max out the settings, they're not the graphics cards that the masses are buying. It's entry-level GPUs like the RTX 3050 and 3060 that they purchase. It's the biggest market. If you go onto the Steam hardware survey, the most recent survey in April 22 shows that the top 10 GPUs are from the $100 to $300 segment. And so I've been wanting the opportunity to play around and showcase a GPU that's targeted towards the masses. Now currently on Amazon, Newegg, and other retailers, the RTX 3050 retails for about $340 at least this model, which for an X50 class card is quite high. Traditionally, these cards have always targeted the $100 to $150 segment, sometimes creeping up to about $200, but you have to realize that all the various GPU segments have been inflated in terms of pricing. Moving on from the preamble, I wanted to begin with talking about the GPU design and aesthetics. The MSI RTX 3050 Gaming X is a pretty nice looking graphics card. It's got that black and gray gunmetal color scheme, which is what we saw with the RTX 3060 Ti Gaming X and the RTX 3080 Gaming X I reviewed back in 2020. In fact, the overall design of the cooler is quite similar to the coolers used on those GPUs, with the same color scheme, angular proportions, and the shape of the plastic shroud. It's been pretty much downsized to accommodate that lower TDP, and one fan is missing. In regards to dimensions, we're looking at 278mm, 130mm for its height, and is 49mm thick, so it's a standard 2-slot GPU and isn't that large, so you shouldn't really have any issues fitting this card into all sorts of cases and ITX chassis. It also uses two 90mm Torx 4.0 fans, which were featured on those expensive GPUs, and I'm glad to see them here because they're excellent fans. They're efficient at moving air and are very quiet. I wish MSI would sell these fans separately in a 120 or 140mm standard configuration so I could use them in my cases. Moving along to the top of the card, we see more of the angular proportions of the shroud and the MSI logo, which does have RGB lighting. And that is actually all the RGB lighting you will get with the shroud. So MSI took a more conservative approach. This also gives us a view of the heatsink, which actually extends past the PCB of the card and has a standard fin density. The heatsink also has 3 copper heat pipes running through it, which are more than adequate. I know it might not seem like a lot, but trust me, once we get into thermals of this GPU, you'll see what I mean. On the rear of the card, we get a nice black metal backplate, which is pretty cool, and what's funny is that this is a lower end card which features a metal backplate, whereas the more expensive 3060 Ti and 3080 had this black plastic graphene backplate. This backplate does also extend past the GPU PCB, and there are also some cutouts to allow air to flow freely throughout the heatsink. What's also really nice is that the frame has been reinforced with anti-bending plates to prevent the PCB from bending due to GPU sag. Also, this card isn't that heavy to begin with. It really only weighs about 939 grams, so that would have been a non-issue to begin with, but it's still nice to include. At the rear of the card, we can see the ports that this card has to offer. You get 3 DisplayPort 1.4a ports and 1 HDMI 2.1 port. So overall, it's a pretty nice looking GPU. It's built with good quality materials and does the job just fine. Let's move on to the specifications of the RTX 3050 Gaming X. The RTX 3050 is powered by Nvidia's Ampere architecture. This GPU is based on the GA106 GPU, which is utilizing Samsung's 8nm node and has a die size of 276mm square. The GPU is packing 2,560 CUDA cores with an SM count of 20 and 80 texture mapping units along with 32 render output units. The 3050 also has dedicated ray tracing hardware, which is interesting because this is Nvidia's first X50 class GPU to feature ray tracing and is the cheapest card in their stack to do ray tracing. The 3050 features 20 2nd gen RT cores and also has 80 3rd gen Tensor cores, which are used for things like DLSS. This model has a base clock of 1552 MHz and a boost clock of 1845 MHz, which is a factory overclock. However, you'll see in our frequency validation, it will boost much further than that. In terms of the memory, the card comes with 8GB of GDDR6 memory, which runs at 14GB per second and has a 128-bit bus. When it comes to power, the GPU has a single 8-pin power connector and has a TDP of 130 watts, definitely on the lower side compared to some of the other Ampere cards I've reviewed. Moving forward, let's do a quick rundown of the test system. For the CPU, we've got an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X, which is cooled by an Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 360 AIO liquid cooler. For the RAM, we've got 4 8GB sticks of Patriot Viper Steel DDR4 3600 CL14 memory. The motherboard is an MSI MEG X570 Unify. For our storage, we've got a 2TB Samsung 970 EVO Plus NVMe SSD. Powering the entire system is an EVGA G3 1000W 80 plus gold certified power supply. If you're interested in full system specs, check the video description down below. Now that we've gotten specifications for the GPU and test system out of the way, it's time we finally jumped into the performance data and benchmarks. To begin with, I wanted to first go over frequency behavior of the MSI RTX 3050 Gaming X, as this will help us validate its boost specifications and see what this particular card can do out of the box. Stats like frequency behavior, thermals, and power were measured and recorded using hardware info, and the stats were measured using a gameplay session of Shadow of the Tomb Raider for about an hour and a half. The RTX 3050 here exhibits some very consistent behavior out of the box, the most consistent I've actually experienced from any of the Ampere GPUs. It averaged an average core frequency of 1977 MHz, so nearly 2 GHz out of the box. That's considerably above the 1845 MHz boost frequency that they advertised for this card. This is similar to the behavior we see with other RTX 30 series GPUs tested. Moving on to thermals, and the RTX 3050 does extremely well here. The GPU averaged a core temp of 52 degrees Celsius and peaked at 63 degrees Celsius. The GPU hotspot averaged 64 degrees Celsius and peaked at 76. Our temperature over time graph also shows us a clearer picture of what happened with thermals. You can see the thermals creep up to over 60 degrees Celsius, and that is because this GPU has a 0 RPM mode, where the fans won't start spinning until the GPU hits a certain temperature. Once the fans kicked on, our temperature does actually go down quite drastically, and we see it hovering in the low to mid 50s. All the while, the GPU was running very quiet, like it was basically inaudible. You'd have to put your head up right against the GPU to hear the fans. These are some excellent thermals out of the box, and you won't have to do any tweaking on your end. And for those of you looking at putting this GPU in a small case where airflow isn't that great, like an ITX case, it shouldn't be too problematic. Next up, we've got power consumption, and the RTX 3050 is a pretty efficient GPU. On average, it only consumed about 118 watts and peaked at 130 watts. This is one of the main reasons as to why we saw such good temps for this GPU. It really doesn't draw that much power. I won't even have to apply any undervolts to this GPU, but hey, if you guys are curious, let me know and I might make a video exploring that topic. Now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, it's time we take a look at some of the gaming benchmarks. Since I don't have a plethora of GPUs on hand, I thought it would have been pointless to make comparisons charts with this GPU and the cards I have laying around, which are in RTX 3080, 3090, and 2080. I mean, those cards are leagues ahead of this, and it just would have looked silly. So instead, what I'll be showing you guys is some gameplay of some of the games I tested. I'll put up the results on the screen as well, and just talk about the experience I had while playing the game. Then we'll take a look at all the games collectively at the end. All of the games I tested used high settings or the high preset, and I tested at 2 resolutions, 1080p and 1440p. So the first game we'll take a look at, and this is a fairly recent one, is Total War Warhammer 3. This is the latest entry into the popular RTS franchise, and at 1080p, the experience I had with this game was a bit of a mixed bag. While we averaged about 56 frames per second, our 1% minimums were at just 33. The experience was playable, but I would have expected more performance from this game because visually it doesn't really look all that impressive. Optimization isn't very good, and I noticed the CPU utilization was quite low, so hopefully some future updates can improve performance and address those problems. Now the good thing is that for a game like this, you don't really need a high frame rate. Even at 30 FPS average, I'd say you'd have a totally playable experience. Next up, we've got Forza Horizon 5, a beautiful open world racing title. And one of my favorites, Forza Horizon 5 is fairly well optimized and runs easily on a wide variety of hardware. At 1080p with the high preset, the RTX 3050 doesn't really have any trouble at all. We attained an average frame rate of 96 FPS and 85 for our 1% lows. I have no complaints at all with how this GPU performs in this title. You can expect a buttery smooth experience while racing. Elden Ring has been one of the most, if not the most popular title of 2022 so far, and rightfully so. FromSoft has delivered another fantastic dark fantasy RPG that challenges the player unlike any other game, while taking you through a vast open world filled with daunting creatures and bosses to test your wits against. For this game, because it has a FPS cap of 60, I had to use flawless widescreen utility to unlock the frame rate so that I could get a good benchmarking result. With the high settings, this game ran pretty well on the RTX 3050. We attained an average frame rate of 64 FPS and got 51 for our 1% lows. With some tweaks and setting a few things to medium, I'm fairly certain you could attain a locked 60 FPS, which is ample performance for such a title as this. Cyberpunk 2077 is a game that is notorious for bringing GPUs to its knees. At 1080p with high settings, the 3050 managed to do decently. It gave me an experience that I would say is playable while still looking visually impressive. We got an average FPS of 54 and our 1% low is measured at 45 FPS. So not terrible, but it wasn't what I'd call optimal either. Again, more tweaking would probably be needed to bring the performance to an adequate level, especially for how fast-paced this game can get in some of its most intensive fights. Moving on, and we have Call of Duty Warzone. This is still a very popular battle royale and can run well on most hardware. With normal settings, we attained an average FPS of 102 and our 1% lows were measured at 81. The experience here was overall quite smooth and you'd have an enjoyable time playing Warzone with this GPU. I didn't have any issues during testing, so there's not much else to say. Next up, we've got another title that is very well optimized, and that is Doom Eternal. Doom Eternal is so well optimized it could probably run on a Nintendo DS just fine. But jokes aside, the RTX 3050 had absolutely no issues pumping lots of frames in this title. We attained an average frame rate of 167 FPS and got 125 FPS for our 1% lows. A buttery smooth experience while you're ripping and tearing. Also, it's great to be able to get performance this high because if you use a high refresh monitor, you'll be able to get the most out of it. This also gives us the headroom to increase settings even more and take advantage of features such as ray tracing, which I'll be talking about later on in the video. Control is a game that I highly recommend everyone to check out. While it didn't have a spectacular story, what made this game so intriguing was its setting, the atmosphere, and the combat was just really fun and unique. If you're wondering how the RTX 3050 performed in this title, then rest easy because it will give you an enjoyable experience. We attained an average FPS of 63, and the 1% minimums were measured at 49 FPS, which for a single player title like this, is completely fine. The last game I wanted to show you guys was Red Dead Redemption 2. I finally got a chance to play this game last year, even though I had used it so much in my benchmarking suite, but this game was a journey like none other. The open world environment was gorgeous, the gameplay was immersive, the story and the characters were spectacular. If you're interested in playing this game with an RTX 3050, then I'm happy to tell you guys that you should be able to get a fantastic experience. At 75 FPS average and our 1% minimums at 59, I had no complaints with how it performed in this title. This is one of those games that I'd say as long as you're averaging about 60 FPS, then you're golden. Alright, so it's time we take a look at the games collectively to get a bigger picture of how the 3050 performs. Across all the titles tested at 1080p, we attained an average frame rate of 83 FPS, which isn't too bad. As you can see, for the vast majority of titles tested, the RTX 3050 attains an average FPS of 60 FPS or above. Really, the only two titles that gave us some questionable performance were Total War Warhammer 3 and Cyberpunk 2077. And that first title is one of those games where if you're not even running at a locked 60 FPS, you can still probably enjoy it and have a playable experience. Also, take into account that most of the titles I tested here are fairly new AAA titles, whereas many people would be using this GPU to play esports titles, which are quite easy to run. And Call of Duty Warzone is an example of that. And if that's what you're going to be doing, then you should expect to attain a buttery smooth performance in those types of games. This is a graphics card that would have been a solid 1080p graphics card, and I'll expand on what I mean by that later on. Now, I did also test games at 1440p to see what this card was capable at a higher resolution. 1440p is becoming quite common, and it's a nice sweet spot in terms of visuals and performance. That's why 1440p 144Hz monitors are quite dominant in the monitor market. However, for the RTX 3050, things aren't really looking too good. Now we're seeing titles show us performance that I'd say just isn't playable, and you wouldn't be able to have an enjoyable experience. Games like Warhammer 3, Cyberpunk, and Control are titles I would not recommend playing at 1440p with an RTX 3050, or you're probably going to have to lower down the settings quite a bit. Then for the titles that attained an average FPS of around 60, you'd still be able to play them just fine. Games like Forza Horizon 5, Elden Ring, Red Dead 2, and some others will still give the player a playable experience at this resolution. Again, just tweak some settings and you should be fine. Then we had games like Mountain Blade 2, Doom Eternal, Warzone, which the performance was absolutely fine, it was still smooth, and I had no complaints with the experience I had even at 1440p. So the 3050 at 1440p is a capable GPU. It can really just come down to what kind of game you're playing at this resolution and what kind of settings you're using. As long as you're not going crazy, you should be fine for the most part. Just take about 5 minutes to tweak things and like I said, you'll be fine. One of the last things I wanted to take a look at before giving you guys my conclusive thoughts was ray tracing. I wanted to check out how this card does when it comes to ray tracing performance because it's the cheapest RTX GPU from Nvidia's family of Ampere graphics cards and is the first time we have an X50 class card that is capable of ray tracing. The first game I wanted to take a look at was Doom Eternal. Now this game didn't initially release with ray tracing but was added last year with an update. Since this game already performed so well without RTX, this gave us the headroom to enable a performance taxing feature like ray tracing. With ray tracing turned on, we can see performance did take a pretty big hit. We dropped about 31% for the average FPS, but still attain 116 FPS and 90 FPS for the 1% lows. So you'd still be able to get a pretty smooth experience while enjoying those sweet RTX visuals. However, if you want to enjoy RTX and maintain good performance, that's where a feature like DLSS can come in handy, and with it enabled, using the balanced setting, we get performance that's very close to what we got with native. Moving on, and we have Control, and this is a title that wasn't perfect at native settings, but still is very playable. However, with ray tracing enabled, we see performance drop significantly to the point where I'd say you really wouldn't have such a great time anymore. However, DLSS does improve things for us once again and brings us back to the experience as to what it was with native. The last game I wanted to take a look at was Cyberpunk 2077. The RTX 3050 already struggled a bit to offer the player good experience without ray tracing, and so with RTX turned on, the performance is just abysmal and completely unplayable. Even with DLSS enabled, the experience wasn't really that good, and so I'd say you can forget about using ray tracing in this title with a 3050. Therefore, when it comes to ray tracing performance, it really depends on the game you're playing, but I think for the vast majority of games, the RTX 3050 will struggle to offer a playable experience with RTX on, and you'd have to resort to using profound DLSS settings, which can cause an adverse effect on image quality. So there you guys have it. The RTX 3050 is an interesting GPU because it's the cheapest Ampere GPU and is currently the cheapest RTX capable GPU from Nvidia. When it comes to native 1080p performance, it's a pretty capable GPU, and it was also able to handle some games at 1440p. A GPU like this would also have no issues at all running some of the most popular esports titles like Warzone, Apex Legends, Rocket League, Fortnite, and more. One of the main reasons why I wanted to take a look at this GPU is because in one of my previous videos I said that if you're on the fence of buying a new GPU or waiting for next generation GPUs, then you could probably buy a lower end card to help you bide your time as a stopgap solution. The RTX 3050, when looking at its performance, seems to be a good candidate. However, as I pointed out at the start of this video, right now the 3050s are selling for around $300 to $350 US. Want to know what else retails for that much? An RX 6600. I don't have an RX 6600 on hand, but just looking at benchmarks from other reputable reviewers, we can see that the RX 6600 is about 20 to 25% faster on average. Since that is the case, why in the world would anyone want to buy an RTX 3050 when they can get an RX 6600 for the same price and attain significantly faster performance? This is why I can't recommend this GPU at its current pricing. If the RTX 3050 retailed for around $200 US, then that would have been a completely different story, and then this card would have looked a lot more appealing and offered the user way more bang for the buck. As it stands right now, there are better alternatives for your money, even if you were looking at this as sort of a stopgap solution. I'm hoping that somewhere in the near future there is a significant price cut for the 3050s, because they just aren't in a good spot. This isn't a knock against MSI, as they're not the ones setting the MSRP, and like I said at the start of the video, I like this card, it looks great aesthetically, has good build quality, has good thermals and acoustics. At the end of the day, it just comes down to pricing. If, however, you still want to buy this GPU because you have a very specific, unique reason for it, I'll have an Amazon affiliate link in the video description to where you can pick one up. I've said this before and I'll say it again, both AMD and Nvidia have totally neglected the mainstream market and the budget GPU market. There hasn't been a single GPU in the segment in the last 5 years that made me go, wow, that is some insane bang for the buck. Nothing since the RX 480 and GTX 1060 days. So here's hoping that next gen might be different. If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.